Hello, everyone. I'm Rashad Robinson, president of Color of Change, and I am honored to be in the company of Laura Murphy, a renowned civil rights and civil liberties advocate who has been a pioneer in racial equity accountability across tech platforms over the past several years. We're here to discuss big tech and the accountability that is necessary, the work to center racial justice on technology platforms, and the work of doing that through racial equity audits. Thank you for joining me, Laura. It's always a pleasure to be in your company and always a pleasure to be in conversation.
Well, you know, I'm a big Rashad Robinson fan, so the feeling is mutual.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, we're going to jump into a lot of technicalities. Well, maybe not too many technicalities. We're going to make this real for you, but we are going to talk technical in some ways, but I think it's important to answer some foundational questions, to just get right in there. Sort of, what is an audit? And given your years of experience in civil rights and how significant is civil rights audits and racial equity audits in this present moment?
Well, an audit is an analysis of a corporation's policies, practices, their metrics, their diversity and inclusion practices, and to determine whether or not those operations are having an adverse impact on people based on their race, their disability, their sexual orientation. So, you know, along a broad category of things, an audit assesses a corporation's practices to determine whether civil rights are being respected.
Yeah, you know, I think it's so clear, right? It's so important that like the audit alone is not the work, right? It's kind of like the diagnosis from a doctor, right? And you still have to do the work. It's the, you know, it's like, you know, your first day going to a gym where they kind of do the weigh-in and all of your like vitals, and then they put you on an exercise plan. If you don't actually go down the road of a plan, then, you know, it might not actually matter.
Well, and that's one thing I should have added.
Yeah.
You know, to me, an effective audit not only does the analysis, but it provides a blueprint for action.
Yes.
And so a good audit, in my opinion, is prescriptive. It helps a company make specific changes in its practices or operations or even its values to be more friendly and respectful of civil rights values and incorporate that into the culture and the actions of the company.
Yeah, so since 2015, Color of Change has called for audits of big tech and have you know, demanded that independent folks come in like yourself and really work to engage big tech around racial injustice and bias within these companies, their products, their policies, their workplace practices. And the demands from the audits are oftentimes coming from a range of actors, you know, former tech employees, content moderators, civil rights activists, elected officials, and everyday users. So many folks are demanding, right, as companies are maybe saying that they care about racial equity, maybe as there's very clear harms that are happening on the platform, these are sort of meant so the companies don't diagnose themselves. You know, we recently released our Beyond the Statement tech platform framework to be used when auditing companies, for tech to not simply say we've done a racial equity audit and we don't sort of know what they mean by that, right? It can mean different things. When you conducted the Facebook audit, I think this is really important because you have such a history from the Airbnb audit to the Facebook audit to advising companies around actually how to move audits forward. You know, what policies and practices when you conducted that did you want to evaluate and why? Were there parts of the business that you wish you had been able to cover but weren't able to?
Well, I'll answer the last part first. Definitely, there was actually more that I really wanted to cover, but I was up against time constraints because the civil rights community had been lobbying Facebook for years about certain practices. And then when Cambridge Analytica happened, and it was revealed that the Russians were using the platform to target Black voters, Muslim voters, others with disinformation about the 2016 election, civil rights leaders became alarmed, and it was like a breaking point. And so groups like Color of Change and the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Muslim advocates, a whole bunch of groups came forward and said, we really want you to conduct an audit like was done with Airbnb. And you all asked me to do that work. And the company evaluated me and said, oh, okay, well, I guess we have to pick her. But anyway, I was charged by the civil rights community to look at key issues. One thing the civil rights community was very concerned about was election interference and voter suppression on the platform. Another thing that the civil rights community was very concerned about was advertising practices that affected ads for housing, employment, and credit. And there was litigation around that, and the civil rights groups were fired up about that. They were concerned about the census and whether or not there would be misinformation about participating in the census on the platform. There was concern about hate speech and violence. The company said that it did not allow hate speech, yet in instance after instance, the groups were pointing to examples of how their members were being targeted through the platform. So I didn't just decide what should be audited. I interviewed over 100 organizations and individuals and came up with a list of top priorities. Now, there were other things on the list. You know, some people were concerned about contracting and diversity and inclusion in employment and at the executive levels of the company. A lot of people were concerned about algorithmic bias. Those two areas we just didn't have time in the time frame that the civil rights community wanted the audit released in to explore those in as much depth as I would have liked. And so really the audit was a reflection of the collective concerns of the community.
So that's so helpful, Laura, because I think, as people may see news stories about the audit, probably way more people read the news stories than sort of read the audit report or saw a news clip or heard folks talking about it. But part of what you're really talking about is the inside-outside aspect of this, right? That there was outside pressure of folks pushing. There was a company that was deeply challenged and kind of had no choice but to deal with the fact that they had sort of said a lot of things about what they were doing, and those things revealed to not be true. And they went down this road of an audit, and then there were like key areas that had to be sort of looked into. And those key areas really tracked back in many ways to civil rights law, to things that had been won and fought for years, but these companies were sort of violating in a range of ways. That sort of inside outside is so incredibly important. It actually speaks to sort of why we've created our framework to serve as a roadmap for tech companies to proactively take steps to preserve and enhance civil rights of their users, right? The framework for us includes calls for several key demands, including increasing transparency, evaluating policy and product for discrimination, holding internal decision makers accountable, and hiring civil rights staff, which I know you and I have both talked about at length. And sort of this Beyond the Statement Tech platform is a continuation of our years-long work to hold these companies accountable. And so, as there's frameworks out there, as you're building your framework, which I'm looking to talk with you about, I think it's really helpful for the people who are watching to sort of hear from you about some of the most striking findings. What did you discover in the audit process? What did the differences in the Airbnb and Facebook processes tell you about the kind of elements that are essential to actually making these audits work?
One of the most interesting things that I discovered was that you can become a billionaire in the tech sphere and never have any understanding of civil rights as a condition of your success. And that's kind of crazy to me. I mean, these companies built entire operations not being aware necessarily of the fights and the history that went into creating civil rights law. And some of these companies even felt that something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act made it so that they didn't have to even comply with civil rights laws. Mm-hmm. And so that was the shocking thing to me, that there were no employees on staff, and no understanding in the highest ranks of what civil rights laws meant for their companies. And so therefore, they did not have an apparatus to understand whether some of their products enabled discrimination or had a discriminatory impact on their users. And so that was, to me, was the most striking finding. And so I had to start with Civil Rights 101, okay? What are the laws out there? What are the values? Do you embrace those values? And they all said they embraced those values, but it broke down in the implementation of those values. And so that to me was the most striking thing, the lack of awareness, and also the understanding that it was crucial that they have relationships with key stakeholder organizations like yours, like Color of Change, like UNIDOS, like Muslim Advocates, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the NAACP, and the Legal Defense Fund. These relationships are crucial. People want to be in conversation with these corporations. They don't want to be at the effect of the corporations, sitting on the outside all the time, banging on the door, getting inconsistent responses, if any. So one key thing is that it is crucial for these companies to develop consistent relationships with outside stakeholder organizations so that there can be some form of external accountability and transparency.
Yeah, it's interesting because all this work sort of intersects with law, right? We were doing these audits during a very different time politically in terms of what was achievable in Washington in terms of public policy change. And now we're in a different place. But you're right, there's all sorts of limitations to the law. Section 230, which we're not going to get into today, is interpreted different ways by different people to, provide
a shield or
immunity or all these things with these platforms get to operate. And that creates all sorts of challenge. Once again, this is why the work of these audits, the work that you're doing to create transparency and visibility into the problem and a roadmap, right, for change, the work that we're trying to do through Beyond the Statement to move these companies which have said Black Lives Matter, but then want to make decisions about how they're going to make Black Lives Matter, say, no, you actually have to follow a set of things to get us there, right? Because so often what I found is that the companies will say they care about civil rights, and I don't want to disagree, but the minute civil rights comes up against profit and growth, civil rights goes out the window. Mm-hmm. And time again, we ended up in these situations where we didn't have the teeth that they could determine what was going to be the important pieces of civil rights that they sort of adhered to and what were the things they didn't, while they didn't have to deal with any of the harms. But speaking of these companies, many of which have gotten really big, explain to the folks, watching, who, maybe on Facebook, and they know that Facebook owns, WhatsApp. They know Facebook owns Instagram, right? How do you sort of approach, how do you think about an audit when you think about sort of the subsidiaries of a company and how to make recommendations that may deal with the mothership, but also need to deal with all of the sort of subsidiaries that make companies, outsized players in the marketplace and make some of the sort of harms that can be at the root of their business practices even more challenging?
Well, I think it's very interesting that these companies were purchased by Facebook. And so they had their own cultures and their own policies. And when I came into the process to conduct the audit, those companies were not as fully integrated as they may appear from the outside. And so I don't think that my audit really reached as deeply into those operations as they should have. So I would say that once a company is acquired, it's incumbent upon the CEO of the corporation, in this case, Mark Zuckerberg, to demand that the subsidiaries adopt the same values as the corporation. And those values should include embrace and respect for civil rights. And so, I think that's an area that really needs to be discussed before an audit is conducted, which is what role will the audit play with subsidiary operations in the corporation? And that's something that we were not really asked about or pressed on until very late in the Facebook audit process. So if I had to do it over again, I would want some clarity from the civil rights organizations about what their expectations are about which aspects of the corporation will be studied and reviewed.
That's really helpful. I mean, one of the things that was studied, looked at, and reviewed throughout the process was the hiring and the need for civil rights capacity, civil rights leadership inside of these companies as new products has developed, as new policies get rolled out. This was a finding in your audit report, and it was something that Color of Change, as well as other civil rights organizations, our friends at the Leadership Conference, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, NAACP, and many other groups really pressed for, which was to get to hire sort of senior level leadership. Roy Austin, previously of the Obama administration, a civil rights attorney, was hired at Facebook to be the vice president of civil rights, a new position created out of the audit, created out of this work, and staff to help deal with some of these challenges on a day-to-day basis. So after you leave with the audit, it's not just, there's not anyone there to carry the ball forward. What, based off of your experiences, does a person like Mr. Austin need to be successful, effective inside of a company? Hope he won't be the only civil rights leadership at a tech company. And so what are the things that we need so that we're not simply dropping experts inside of companies that don't have the ability to be effective?
Roy needs ongoing support from the civil rights community and ongoing dialogue with the civil rights community. The civil rights community needs to make it clear to the leadership of Facebook that they are watching how this operation is funded, how often it is included in key decisions, how much this person is able to speak out about the civil rights concerns of the company. There needs to be a chorus that continues to make clear its concerns and its demands, so that Roy knows and Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg know that these issues, these sets of issues, are still a big priority for the community. So my concern with all of this civil rights infrastructure that we will be recommending to other corporations is that these people not be dropped in and isolated, but they are in fact part of a larger conversation and community, so that they know that they have the ongoing support of the community, and that the community expects these people to be effective internal agitators and advocates for civil rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's so important. I mean, it just speaks to your focus on impact, right? That you weren't doing the audit, as you said earlier, just to put out a bunch of recommendations, but to provide a roadmap. So, how would implementation of the audit's recommendations make a difference in people's everyday lives? And what does accountability look like from your perspective to help achieve that?
Well, I'll just give you one example of something that we argued for in the context of the audit. We argued that politicians should have to follow the same community standards at Facebook that everybody else did. And Facebook said, no, 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 politicians are different. We need to let the population monitor what they say. The population has a right to know what they say. But we have seen politicians become agents of voter suppression, agents of violence, agents of hate speech. And so we as a civil rights community argue, no, they should be held to the same standards. They should not be allowed to engage in voter suppression or hate speech or put out misinformation. Well, almost a year after the audit, Facebook came to the same conclusion. So to me, that is a real life impact, that people are not going to be harmed by a politician saying, vote on, Wednesday when the election is actually on Tuesday. I mean, that is a overstatement of an example, but just to give you the understanding that politicians are these powerful individuals that can harm voters. And they should not be allowed to use a platform like Facebook to give misinformation and to harm voters and to undermine lawful ways of voting. And so I think that's one real life impact. Another real life impact is something that came out of Color of Change's report about advocates and activists being kicked off the platform. It was opaque about why you were being kicked off at Facebook. And now there's much more clarity about when you're kicked off, why you're kicked off, and what your appeals rights are. And also, there were advocates and activists that you pointed out who would put up a post saying, my car was just painted with a swastika, and show a picture. And they were kicked off the platform because they showed a swastika, even though they were denouncing the swastika, right? Yeah. And so the company has made strides in preventing that from happening. So the voices of people are being heard. I'm really, really pleased. And I said this before, if I did nothing else, to push Facebook to settle the civil rights litigation that declared the litigation that accused Facebook of having biased practices with regard to housing, employment, and credit that harmed Black and Brown users in the eyes of the civil rights groups. Well, the Facebook decided to settle those lawsuits as a result of the audit and to put in a whole series of reforms. So now you will be able to see every employment ad on Facebook, every housing ad. And people are not reading newspapers. They're not buying newspapers to find housing and employment. They're going online. So a platform as powerful as Facebook should not be limiting who could see, and that should not be falling down along lines of age and race and gender. And so you should be able to see everything that is advertised on Facebook with regard to those categories. And so I think that has a real life impact on people's socioeconomic mobility. So I'm very excited about that. So that's just a few examples, plus all the money they put into minority business as a result of the audit. I think, I'm looking always, Rashad, and I think you are too, for tangible outcomes.
Yeah.
And not just good words, not just reforming policies, but things that make a real difference in the lives of people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this does come down to power in so many ways, right? Resetting the rules, resetting sort of power. I mean, you talked about what it took to get Facebook to settle those lawsuits, right? It just speaks to the way in which self-regulation alone won't work, that we need to we need to create counterbalances to these huge platforms, which have so much power and so much reach. And these audits give us the tools to actually know what we're balancing. like to give us visibility into what we're making those demands on, because you're absolutely right. We want to make real change, but oftentimes the lack of transparency, the lack of visibility makes it so that we don't even know the roots or the sort of the deepest level impact of the actual problem. Sort of as we start coming to a close, Laura, many companies have conducted, or many corporations have conducted, and others are considering conducting racial equity audits. What can these corporations gain from conducting an audit? We have talked so much about what the civil rights community can gain, about sort of how do we advance equity from our end, but making real world change is not zero sum, right? And so what do the companies actually gain as well?
Well, the companies have markets, and the marketplace is constantly changing because of competition, but also because of population change. We are going to be a majority minority country in the United States very soon. And so the companies that don't establish trust with a broad base of consumers and stakeholders are not going to profit down the road. It's just the simple fact. And it's going to be harder for them to attract customers. It's going to be harder for them to attract talent if they don't respond to the interests of these diverse constituencies that make up the consumer base. And so without the trust and the respect of the consumer base, companies are going to lose market share. So they stand to gain profitability. They stand to gain consumer trust and support. They stand to gain better branding and image. So if they don't take care of these problems, they're creating a situation where their bottom line is at risk. And I think the smart companies will embrace civil rights audits because they will understand it's in their enlightened business interest to do so, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do.
It's so important as you look at the next phases of your work, right? I think about this past summer when racial justice became a majoritarian issue, right? More Americans than ever saying they wanted to stand up for racial justice, that they believed racial justice was an important issue in polling. We saw upticks in voter registration. We saw people turning out into the streets when the best that many people thought we could do in terms of activism was clap outside of our windows or uplift investigative journalism. Racial justice was such a powerful motivating force, and it motivated a lot of corporations, both the employees at those companies and in the goodwill of maybe even some of the leaders to make statements about where they stood on the issues. And sometimes those statements haven't actually led to the changes that, well, in fact, most of the time, those statements have not led to the real change. It's why we launched Beyond the Statement, and across many different sort of industries are working to sort of put action behind those words. But you're moving your work forward in a lot of different creative ways. I'd love for you to share a little bit about sort of what's next for your work as we sort of move into this moment of change dynamics where more companies are considering racial equity and racial justice and civil rights audits, and we have to do the work to make sure that there's the type of rigor that you've brought to this work across the field.
Well, thank you. And I don't stand for the proposition that my audits were perfect, but I did attempt to bring a level of rigor to Airbnb and to Facebook. And what I decided is that I wanted to take a break from actually doing the audits for a couple of months because I'm writing out what I think the crucial elements of any civil rights audit should be. And I'm doing that in cooperation with 25 civil rights leaders. I've interviewed Color of Change and other organizations to get their input, because what I'm afraid of is that this will become, there will be created faux civil rights audits that won't have the transparency, that won't have the engagement of the CEO, that won't produce public reports. So right now, what I'm trying to do, Rashad, is create a baseline for what any legitimate racial justice or civil rights audit should include. And I'm building on the work that you have started. And I want to compliment you on your Beyond the Statement initiative, because this is exactly what we need. We need to be clear as a community what we want and how we want it done. You can't do an audit with someone who's not culturally competent or independent. You can't do an audit if it's not publicly released. You can't do an audit without the support of the CEO. Those are some of the elements that I think are crucial going forward, because we've developed this new tool together, Rashad. And, it's not a substitute for litigation. It's not a substitute for congressional oversight or agency regulation. But in the short term, it offers a real possibility to get some tangible results to make society more fair and equitable.
Yeah, I so appreciate you, Laura. This discussion couldn't have been done without you. And so just thank you for agreeing to be in conversation about these issues that can sometimes feel deeply complicated, but we are invested at Color of Change of bringing you all into the strategy, bringing you all into the conversation, helping you understand how we are trying to leverage the voices and aspirations, hopes, dreams, anger, demand to actually push institutions to be more responsive to the needs and the concerns of Black folks, with a deep understanding that when Black people win, our country moves in the right direction. All the work, Laura, you have done on civil rights and big tech is not just foundational, but is aspirational in terms of what we need more companies to be committing to. Before we end, I want to encourage all of you who are watching and to take action with us, to hold big tech accountable to these demands, and to hold platforms accountable more broadly for their policies and their practices and the impacts on Black folks and Black communities. To learn more, you can engage us at colorofchange.org, but you can also take action at beyondthestatement.com. So beyondthestatement.com, you can take action, sign petitions, figure out more about the goals. And in particular, because this is the 1-year kind of anniversary of the sort of final release of the Facebook civil rights audit that Laura led, this is an opportunity to re-engage Facebook for their public commitment around how they are taking the steps to make that audit fully real, right? The audit is a diagnosis and a roadmap, but a diagnosis and a roadmap is nothing without action. And action does not happen without your voice, without you all getting involved, engaging, and translating the presence and the visibility of this moment into the power to actually make real change. Laura, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Rashad.